On March 1, 2018, during the 37th session of the Human Rights Council at the United Nations in Geneva, the Coordination of the Associations and Individuals for Freedom of Conscience organized a side event on the denial of religious freedom in China and the case of the Church of Almighty God. The event was introduced and coordinated by Mr. Thierry Valle, the president of CAPLC. A panel of international scholars and human rights and freedom of religion experts discussed the dramatic situation of the members of the Church of Almighty God, both in China, where they are severely persecuted, and in South Korea and Europe, where their requests for asylum are often denied. During the event, attendees also watched a video with testimonies of 3 members of the Church of Almighty God who suffered brutal persecution at the hands of the authorities of the Chinese Communist Party. Their stories roused profound reflection generally. Professor Massimo Intervinian, a well-known Italian scholar of new religious movements and managing director of Center for Studies on New Religions, introduced the current situation of religious persecution in China, as well as the persecution against the Church of Almighty God in China. Professor Massimo Intervinian said, "Many CAG members have been tortured in China, and some died while in custody in highly suspicious circumstances." Ms. Leah Pericrest, Deputy Director of Human Rights Without Frontiers, stated in the text of her speech that the means of torture that the authorities in China have used against the Church of Almighty God members are particularly gruesome. The use of physical torture, deemed illegal in international law, has been widely documented about the CCP government's use of torture amongst the cases they've collected. In recent years, the CCP's crackdown and suppression of the Church of Almighty God have continued to escalate. Some of the Church of Almighty God Christians who couldn't live in China were forced to abandon their homes and flee to overseas democracies for asylum. However, they have encountered many difficulties in their asylum requests in South Korea and in several European countries, where most of their requests for asylum are often denied. Some even received departure orders from the governments of their host countries, facing the risk of forced repatriation. Professor Massimo Intervinian said, "As a scholar concerned with religious liberty, I regard it as scandal that in South Korea and in several European countries, under various pretexts, the obvious fact that CAG asylum seekers would face persecution if they would return to China is sometimes not recognized." Mr. Eric Roux, the president of European Interreligious Forum for Religious Freedom, stated in the text of his speech,
"The difficulties that the members of the Church of Almighty God face with respect to their asylum request in France are not very different from those they encounter in other European countries. Nevertheless, we will list the main, and in my opinion, they are wrong, the wrong reasons for which an overwhelming percentage of requests have been denied in France for the members of the..."
He also presented, "The Church of Almighty God is suffering persecution in China. There is no doubt that its members face a real and immediate risk of being sent to jail based on their religious affiliation if sent back to China, where thousands of them have been tortured, and at least 30 members lost their life in jail." Mr. Eric Roux also pointed out, "The decisions made by the French authorities regarding the asylum seekers should be taken with the real knowledge of the Church based on in-depth studies, not on Chinese anti-cult propaganda or journalists who merely repeat it. It is of utmost importance to become acquainted with this academic literature in order to correct the data they were relying upon due to the lack of reliable sources, and treat the asylum seekers of the Church of Almighty God Christians correctly. because it is a matter of the safety of persecuted Christians and a matter of life or death. Sending back to China members of the Church of Almighty God is tantamount to being accomplice of the persecution they will have to suffer. As for the situation that several countries just saw the fake news spread by the CCP, and they couldn't really know the truth about the CCP's persecution against religious freedom. Professor Massimo Intervenian presented in the side event that the murder of women in the McDonald's diner in Zhaoyuan, Shandong in 2014 was committed by a different religious movement, with nothing to do with Church of Almighty God.
2017,
He was invited by the CCP-related Chinese Anti-Xie Association to two 2017 conferences in Zhengzhou and Hong Kong, but concluded, based on documents supplied by the Chinese authorities themselves, that the accusations against the Church of Almighty God are fake news fabricated by the Chinese propaganda. Ms. Rosita Shorite, a former Lithuanian diplomat who is currently president of International Observatory of Religious Freedom of Refugees, presented that members of groups that are really persecuted because of their religion have an absolute right to refugee status according to international conventions. The 5 principles of interpretation of the Convention relating to the status of refugees and the protocol relating to the status of refugees are binding for Korea and the European countries. She said, refugee boards and courts seem to adopt a restricted interpretation of persecution. It is not necessary to prove that the asylum seeker has been personally persecuted. Being a member of a persecuted group is enough. Of course, that the Church of Almighty God is a persecuted group in China is obvious. In her opinion, it should be enough to prove that the asylum seeker is really a member of the Church of Almighty God and is not simply an economic immigrant. Professor Massimo Intervenian presented, there can be no reasonable doubt that the mere fact of being a member of the Church of Almighty God in China means to be exposed to a serious risk of imprisonment for several years, if not worse. This should mean that the Church of Almighty God members who reached other countries are entitled to the status of refugees for reasons of religious persecution. Democracy, liberty, equality, and human rights are the values commonly pursued by human beings in the 21st century. At the opening ceremony of the 37th session of the Human Rights Council at the United Nations on February 26, Mr. Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of the United Nations, presented in his speech, to make human rights reality for everyone, we need to try more determined and coherent action. We must speak up for human rights in an impartial way without double standards. In China, after the new revised regulations on religious affairs was carried out formally on February 1, 2018, the further persecution of religious freedom by the CCP government and the situation of human rights has been worsening increasingly. The consequences would be dreadful to contemplate if those Christians who fled China are sent back. Their basic human rights and freedom of religious belief should be protected. Thank you so much for watching. See you next time.